For the documentary series Researchers and Their Fields, 24 interviews with academics from Tilburg University were recorded. The interviews focused on the choices researchers make. What is high-quality research, and how do they strive to meet these criteria? To what extent do they engage with practice and theory to ground their work? What inspires and frustrates them? This documentary focuses on interdisciplinarity. How do specialized researchers get their heads around complex societal problems? To what extent are fields open to researchers with different perspectives? How do researchers reconcile the ruptures that separate their disciplines? How do you feel the social sciences relates to the humanities?
I do think there's a lot of overlap or a larger area where they do touch. There are differences. I think some of the social sciences, anthropology, cultural anthropology is often counted among the social sciences, but I think in its character is far more like the humanities. But the more quantitative social science type of studies, they tend to be more looking at larger patterns in behavior rather than individual motivation or rather cultural preferences. So I do think there's some difference as well, but there's a whole range of topics where one could study those and in a sense does the same. There's a lot of anthropological research within the humanities. There's a lot of psychological research within linguistics. The boundaries are not very strict.
Is the holy grail then, in the end, an interdisciplinary research effort where everything collides?
I think no. I think, well, it's helpful to have interdisciplinary research. For instance, if you are studying ecological issues where culture is facing problems, and those have a cultural dimension as well as a technical dimension, or health issues, the Ebola crisis in Africa, influence is also about culture. It's also about how people bury their dead, how they and what it means to them, and not just a health issue in a very technical sense. So then you need to be interdisciplinary. You need people who bring different types of knowledge. But I don't see one big kind of new discipline where everything is merged in a sense. I do think there are different competences that people bring to research, and that is helpful.
So there's value in disciplinarity as well.
Yes, I do think it's good, partly because it's too much for an individual. So it's good if you have some people who are very focused on cultural issues, maybe issues of discrimination, bias in a culture. Some others who are far more focusing on socioeconomic processes, how do people feed themselves or their group. And at some point, they touch upon each other, but specializing and having a particular type of analysis is, I think, helpful. So I think you need a disciplinary basis in order to be interdisciplinary.
So is there a strong relationship between cognitive neuroscience and the wider social sciences?
Yeah, I think, what the social sciences are doing is they are going to use more nowadays our techniques. So, for example, social psychology. For example, there is a researcher now and who wants to do experiments in our lab because he wants to use, for example, in an experiment, the sweat response. So you can measure how you sweat, and that is a measure of arousal. And he has an idea about something, and he uses our technique. So I think that the whole field is borrowing and picking the best techniques from each other. So I think it's the whole playing field is broader now. Yeah.
In terms of theories or perspectives?
It's different because we ask different questions, for example. We are focused on functions that our brain uses daily. For example, perception, that's one. Reasoning, memory, motor behavior, all these things that you apply without knowing, we are investigating that. And other people, other researchers in psychology, they have different questions on a higher level. So because we try to explain behavior, because that's basically what we do. So I call myself a neuroscientist, but actually I'm a psychologist. And we are trying to explain behavior. And we do that with our questions and our techniques, and other psychologists want to know about personality, for example, or about individual differences. We are not interested in individual differences now, but other people are. Or how people function, I'm not sure, in a factory or at work.
No. So what you consider as noise or error in the brain is exactly what other fields in psychology focus on.
It could be, yeah.
There's another interesting commonality that has now appeared with data science, because both data scientists and ethnographers, well, people might think that these are two opposites in one way of doing research. Both of these approaches basically have the idea that the data, the data will speak, so to speak. Mm-hmm. That's the expression. That the patterns will appear from the data. Of course, there are obvious differences between the two, but there are also this kind of striking similarities between approaches that seem strikingly dissimilar on the surface.
That implies that there's a role for ethnography in a highly technical field like artificial intelligence.
Yes, and there are approaches such as ethno-mining, for instance, which specifically tries to combine large-scale data collection with ethnography. Yes. And ethnography is used also in many technical fields to try and make sense of user experience.
To fine-tune the interface of the technology.
Exactly, yes.
The Department of Cognitive Science and Artificial Intelligence has very clear links with the Social Sciences Department, School of Social Sciences, but also with other schools within the campus that offer, say, data science related programs. So it is a very multidisciplinary department in nature, which is situated in the School of Humanities, which has a lot of offering, but at the same time it is well connected to other units within the university.
And if we would zoom in on your particular work, mm-hmm. and for example, philosophy, what is ethics, is philosophy relevant to studying how people learn a language?
Philosophy itself has a very long history of studying language. So philosophy of language is a very lively branch of philosophy. A lot of prominent figures in studying human language have come from philosophy. So even to this day, there is still a very strong link with philosophy between cognitive science of language particularly, and also even artificial intelligence. Nowadays, this link has been even more highlighted because of the focus on explainable AI and responsible AI, because now we have more and more artificial intelligence systems that actually find their way into our daily lives and affect decision-making processes. And now it's become much more clear that we have to pay attention to the ethics of AI. So philosophers have come back and have a very strong presence. Also within our program, we certainly spend a lot of time on offering courses to the students on the ethics of AI and ethics of data science and how to make machine learning techniques more transparent and more interpretable and also more responsible. So yeah, there are certainly very strong links there.
But then the analysis of non-fictitious fictitious material might be very close to how an historian approaches his or her data.
Yeah, that is interesting that you are coming up with this, because this is really now in the heart of what I'm doing with other colleagues as well. Let me refer to an interesting theorist now in France, Ivan Jablonka. He has published a book in 2014 in which this exactly was his argument. So you have history, historians, you have social sciences, and in the middle you have literature. And let's say at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, people would say these are different categories, different disciplines. But what we see now is that there is much more intersection between the three. So the historian is making use of literary mechanisms, social sciences is making use of facts and fiction, and the literary people, the literary authors, are combining facts and fiction as well. So it is no use in separation, making a very strict separation between these disciplines. It is much more relevant to see the connections here.
Because narratives are present in each of these traditions.
History is a contemporary literature. That is the title of his book. And for instance, as he considers himself in the first place as a historian, and he has written the biography of his grandparents. And you could say it's an autobiography. It's a very personal story, but it also is a story that helps us. That is giving us knowledge about what happened in the 20th century, how the history of Europe developed, and what are the difficult problems that we still have to deal with.
Life stories are based in cultures, and cultures come with norms, and that's very much in line with what sociologists study, of course, like current trends in societies and so on. And those current trends in societies should also be present in narratives. So if we would repeat our study 20 years from now, culture might have changed, which should probably also have an impact on the content of the narratives.
The society is more than the sum of individuals. So society is more than that. But the problem is always, well, how do you study that? I mean, when we want to study the influence of, for instance, values on the economy, on economic outcomes, or on democracy, we often have this idea of Coleman's both. So Coleman's both is that you have a macro level phenomena, like for instance, economic society, or let's call it as an example this idea of Max Weber's Protestant ethic. So you start as a explanation, like the Protestant ethic, and then you want to know if it has an influence on the generation of capitalism, on capitalism as a market force. Well, how does Protestant culture, how does it actually have an influence on the economy, on economic market forces? Well, Coleman's both, this paradigm of James Coleman, it starts from the idea that, well, you need to have like individuals, people at an individual level that actually behave in a certain kind of way, that have certain kind of values, that actually channel this relationship between culture and economy, for instance. If you live in a certain kind of country with a Protestant ethic, with strong, where the religion actually emphasizes horizontal relationships, but also that the money that you make, that you need to reinvest it to make more money. Well, this culture should influence how people think, how people behave, and that in the end should have an influence on economic models, economic outcomes. That's basically the idea. So that's how you go from one macro level phenomena to explaining an outcome at the macro level again.
What is the added value of interdisciplinary research?
So much that I don't know where to begin, to be honest. Because let's stick to my example, cosmetic surgery. That is what I use the most. It has to do with economics, with their work. I had not expected. It has to do with psychology, with how confident are you about your body, how maybe you have some self-hatred. It has to do with sociology, how about the visual culture, all the images we have of young beautiful women, what does that do with young women? So that is not so much an individual psychological question, but it is a more social cultural question. It has to do with history. Now we have cosmetic surgery. So now we see that women say, I can't live like this. I need to have this cosmetic surgery. If not, I kill myself, I'm sure. That is something that wasn't said when we had not cosmetic surgery. So that has to do with history. In other days, the corset was very important. Now the body is more exposed. So this, you have history, you have sociology, you have economics, you have psychology, all in one research. And I can say, no, I'm only interested in psychology. Then I'm only going to ask you, so you're not that happy with your body. Is there more you're not happy with, etc., etc.? I can do that, but that won't enrich my study.
So if you want to understand the phenomenon, you need to include the various perspectives.
Yeah, for me that is the case. So also if you want to understand a phenomenon like anorexia nervosa, I guarantee you that you understand it far less if you do not study the history and when it emerged and how it emerged. And if you do not know in which countries, in which cultures it'll emerge. It is important to know that, very important.
So what I'm trying to do in my research is to connect organization to the regulatory environment by looking at, the effect of new regulations on organizations in highly regulated environments such as healthcare, but also looking at how organizations react to institutional shocks. So that sort of the connection between macro and meso, where meso for me is the organizational level. And I also try to connect the meso with the micro. So connection between organizations, organizational strategy, their business model to really the targeted community, the individuals there.
Academically, that also seems to require connection with other disciplines.
Yes, absolutely. So I work a lot with, healthcare scholars, health policy scholars. I work a lot with the marketing scholars, for example, to see, we did a lot of studies on consumer preferences in the base of the pyramid, for example. I work with sociologists, I work with human resource scholars. So yes, I'm an engineer by training, and I also, studied and taught and worked for 7 years in a medical school. So interdisciplinary research and activity is really my focus, what I enjoy doing. It's not without challenges, of course, because that means that you need to develop a comprehensive understanding of the other disciplines. Point of view, research methods, epistemology, outlook on what research is, what knowledge is, which sometimes requires a bit of study, open-mindedness, and so on. So yes.
So what are these challenges then that you need to confront?
Well, when I went, for example, so I have a PhD in business administration. I studied in a department of management, really, during my PhD. Then I had a postdoc in a sort of, let's say, interdisciplinary environment, let's say, and then I stepped over to the medical faculty. Now, when I went to the medical faculty, I brought with me my, research methods, theory from the management field, and I was trying to apply them in the healthcare domain. Now, I didn't know anything about healthcare, if not as a patient, so I had to really sort of study a lot to get a grasp on what, healthcare organization, healthcare management, healthcare policy is, how it's different across country, and also the kind of research that is done tends to be a little bit more applied. So the kind of theoretical development is less, and there's much more focus on, let's say, the results and implication for policymakers and for patients. It took some time for me to adjust to that and to enjoy that for a period of time. Then after a period of time, I was sort of missing the theoretical development. So to what extent I can make healthcare as my empirical setting and generalize and my research to other organizations. And that's where I stepped over again to an organization studies, let's say, department and more management research again.
I'm in the field of law and economics, so to a large extent what we try to do is also bring in a number of techniques, like for instance empirical techniques like developed in econometrics within the legal environment, and try to collect large numbers of data in order to assess what the results from a legal perspective could be.
The research tradition in economics or in finance or even in corporate finance is of a different nature than that in legal studies, in the sense that there's much more model building based on fundamental assumptions as to how actors behave, so how they interact. How do you reconcile these differences? How do you bring these fields together?
I think so. We're relatively close to corporate finance in particular, because also shareholders are in fact the capital providers. Now, I think one of the elements that for us is certainly always there, but sometimes not necessarily is always in the same way incorporated into the model, is what they would call the institutional framework. So you start from, I would translate institutional framework in a corporate finance perspective into a regulatory framework. So what is in fact also the rules that are also needs to be obeyed by all parties? And that is the first element from which sometimes also hypotheses and so on could be derived to analyze. So in that perspective there is a similarity. The difference might be that we most of the time go one step further, which brings it, well, one step further. Corporate finance and these corporate finance scholars are excellent researchers, that's not the issue. But quite often what we also do bring into account, as I just came to tell you, is that in an international environment you still work with national laws. So if we start to compare behavior of shareholders or behavior within corporate finance literature as such in an international environment, we definitely also must make sure, and we want it also, that these different models that are developed, that the model that is developed takes into account in an appropriate way the fact that the regulatory environment in different countries is different. The consequence is here, and that is in fact a difficulty for us in particular, is that it quite often then reduces the possibilities of research, because most of the time the law is not saying yes or no, but yes if a number of conditions have been satisfied, or no unless a number of conditions. So these are all different elements, and that makes it much harder to take them on board in your modeling, to make sure that you still are in the line with the regulatory framework and aligned with the framework and still find sufficient data.
So the difficulty of measuring the constructs that come from these corporate finance models in practice restricts your ability to derive large conclusions that apply at a large scale.
Well, it not necessarily in that same. So what it can be done is that for more specific issues, we can say something. previously I mentioned the element about the mandatory dividend distributions if you make profit, yes or no. Yeah, that is particular in one country, so you limit immediately to a certain extent the observation, the number of observations. So it reduces it. So on the one side we can then for a very specific rule we can explain something, but also at the same time, due to the lower number of observations, quite often our finding is less robust. So we have to be much more careful. If you have a lot of data, quite often your results are pretty robust because you have taken on board so many data. So that puts more, let's say, power into the model, which in our system quite often is less the case.
And then it becomes more complicated to make normative statements.
Yes,
about what you should do.
Yes, that is indeed a very important one. We have to always be careful because of the fact that the regulatory framework is almost never straightforward, let's say, a dummy variable, yes or no.
Is the social sciences angle also relevant for the more normative or descriptive research traditions?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure it's traditionally the case, but to my mind, if I start doing more normative research, asking myself the normative question of whether the law should be the way it is or should maybe be different, to my mind, it is extremely important to also look at social sciences, because only those social sciences can teach you what kind of problems there actually are in society, how you can explain them, etc.
Is law as a field then a social science?
In a way, yes. Because law is about society, of course, but I think there are also many approaches to law that would be characterized more in terms of humanities, in terms of the arts, maybe even theology, the very dogmatic normative research. It's certainly not like all criminal law research would take the approach of trying to establish causality and things like that. No. So it can also be very different than traditional social sciences.
Now you focus on the law not in isolation, so not on the legal text itself, but also on the wider environment in which it developed, the social environment in which it developed, and on which it has an impact. Does that also imply that you reach out to other disciplines yourself?
Yes, actually there is no project anymore that I conduct without trying to adopt a multidisciplinary or an interdisciplinary research method. Admittedly, when we work together, for example, with philosophers, economists, sociologists, etc., we often apply a multidisciplinary approach. I look at it from the legal perspective, and a philosopher looks at it from a philosophical perspective. But increasingly, we try to adopt a real interdisciplinary approach where we try to understand each other's approaches, where we try to elevate our approach to a higher level by taking into account each other's viewpoints and each other's methodologies. And increasingly this is important. For example, I'm looking at the impact of blockchain and distributed ledger technologies. The most important or the most popular use is Bitcoin, for example, but there are much broader potential uses of blockchain, for example, by companies, by ports, but also by governments. And when I look at it from the legal perspective, that's not enough. You also have to look at it from the technical perspective, but also take into account the societal implications, and for example, also look at ethical issues. And when everybody looks from his or her own perspective, that's okay, but you can elevate the analysis and get better results when you combine all these different approaches. For example, you can call this legal compliance by design, because in the end we want legal compliance, we want that the rules and regulations are abided by, but you can make it more efficient by do that by design. But then you, for example, need computer scientists too, and increasingly we are paying more attention to working together and elevate our research approaches in an interdisciplinary way, which will be beneficial for all the analysis that are conducted right now and in the future.
Moving from multidisciplinarity to interdisciplinarity requires the, as you call it, the elevation of methods or the integration of approaches. That seems difficult to do.
It is very difficult, and I think the first thing that we should do, and it sounds easy, but often it isn't that easy, is that we have to learn to speak each other's language, and you don't do that, on one day. A philosopher needs more than one day to understand all the legal terminology and the way we think. For example, our focus on the primary source of information, laws and regulation, and then how this is applied by judges, etc. And for us, it takes some more time to understand how a philosopher thinks and how a philosopher conducts a certain philosophical approach. And often that takes weeks, that takes months. I think that in the end takes years to collaborate with each other and first of all to try to understand each other's language in order to be able to also adopt and understand the approach of another discipline. Because I believe that right now there are too much boundaries between different faculties, between different disciplines. But even within a faculty, there are also quite high walls between, for example, public law and private law. Increasingly, we are trying to tear down these walls. That's important, but often these walls are institutionalized because you have certain departments and you have certain faculties, each with their own rules, with their own funding, etc. So I think also at the institutional level, it will be important to develop and maintain very strong relations across disciplines. And I think that's the first but the main challenge that we are facing right now to conduct good interdisciplinary research, to create, establish and maintain better relations across disciplines.
But doesn't that not mostly create more complexity with the risk that in the end you're not able to come to a joint conclusion?
Yes, on the one hand, no, on the other hand, because increasingly our society is becoming more and more complex. Increasingly there are more and more laws and regulations, but there are more and more impacts on our society. For example, when you look at robotization and the impact or potential impact of artificial intelligence, for example, these aspects, these issues, these challenges, they are more complex than the challenges we faced, let's say, 1 or 2 centuries ago. So yes, I think it makes the analysis more complex, but we need a more complex analysis because the issues and the challenges that we are facing are becoming increasingly complex too. So that needs requires a more complex analysis.
You work with philosophers, political scientists, perhaps even engineers in your
increasingly yes.
your blockchain project. Is there kind of a recipe that applies to all these different forms of cooperation, or does that vary a lot?
Well, I first of all always take the time to get to know the involved researchers from the other disciplines, and that takes more time than just have an email exchange. So we always try to meet a few times to talk to each other, to get on the same page, and to try to achieve the same goal, and then adopt our different approaches and try to come to a combined approach. And that's the main important issue, to have good understanding of each other, and in the end to have a very good schedule and a very good way to conduct the research and have the same agenda. I think that's the most important, to get the same agenda and to try to achieve the same research goals. And that takes some time, and you have to take that time in order to come to a better collaboration.
Yeah, and I think now in my recent work, it really combines the two interests I have, like the clinical interest, like which of course is also broader than just physiotherapy, but more like, you know, the whole healthcare system. And also I find it very fascinating, you know, people having all kind of health problems, and, you know, we go to a doctor or therapist and something needs to be done or not. So these are very practical, pressing issues. And then of course you have philosophy, and philosophers just, well, they first think for 3 days and then they do something. But yeah, I like the two things, like both the practical side and the theoretical and reflection.
And in a sense you then combine the humanities approach that studies the products of the mind with the more social sciences approach that studies individual behavior.
Yeah, I think that's good to say, and I think also, I never know. So like anthropology, I think is normally also it's in the social sciences, isn't it? Normally, yeah. Well, it's also on the intersection, but I think, yeah. So anthropology, maybe it's a part of the social science, but yeah, it's also the whole ethnography thing. I think it's a social science kind of method. And then the humanities side is more maybe the interpretation side, and also the interest in narratives. It's also, so how do people talk about themselves? How do they give meaning to their lives, etc. Yeah.
Is it challenging to bring those two different research traditions together?
Yeah. It can be challenging, yeah. Also, of course, for yourself, it's a long way, because you have to, because I was trained in philosophy, but then you have to also kind of train yourself in other kind of research methods, and of course it goes along the way when you work with other people. So that is for yourself, it can be a challenge, but also like in practical, if you want to publish things, it can be difficult to, you know, be a little bit in between, because a lot of journals, they are either humanities or social science, although nowadays it's changing a little bit. And of course, a lot of emphasis is put on the idea of interdisciplinarity, and I think I'm working very interdisciplinary, but you know, still it's I think it's easier to publish when you're really within one discipline. So that is, but I think it's more challenging just to be all over the place, or all over the place, but in different disciplines. Yeah.
And it offers compensating benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah.